Okay, more people in the waiting room. Right. While we get ready to go, maybe you can just tell us where are you calling from? It's also always exciting to see our global network present. I can share that we had 98 registrations for this session. So it is a hot topic, and we are very, very happy to be here with you today to talk about Ecovillage and climate action. The ReGEN4ALL team, many of us are here present. Maybe I'll just ask the team to wave your hands. Good to see you around. So ReGEN4ALL is an Erasmus-funded project, and we are doing our best to bridge, to make knowledge gained within and through ecovillages more accessible, both for research and decision makings on sustainable lifestyles. This project has 4 partners: GEN, officially represented by GEN Europe, Ecovillages, Lois, the Danish Ecovillage Network, and the University Institute of Lisbon. And we are here today for our 3rd colloquium with very special guests. Maybe I'll just let you know that both Rebecca and Mark, you can also wave your hands, are our support team for today. So you can let them know in the chat if you need anything. All right, so in terms of structure, we will be starting with Albert Bates from the farm, and then we are going to pass on to Christoph. He's having some challenges in connecting, but hopefully he will be with us very soon from Sieben Linden, and then we'll pass it on to Chelsea. Thank you so much, the 3 of us, for joining us. And as we are getting ready to start, some of our inspiring questions, like the team was brainstorming about relevant topics, and thank you, the GEN Research Group, also for giving us inspiration. What does climate action mean to you? How are ecovillages responding to the climate crisis on a daily basis? Are there solutions that could be applied outside ecovillages? What are the key learnings regarding climate action? What are some of the big obstacles communities face in realizing their climate action goals? What kind of innovations are ecovillages proposing to climate action? What is the role of GEN and other community-led initiatives in climate action? What is your experience on it? And we carefully invited 3 guests that will be able to light this discussion. First, I will introduce you Albert Bates. Albert is a resident at the farm Ecovillages since the 70s. He was part of the creation of the Global Ecovillage Network. He's one of our representatives at the UN climate conferences, the COPs. He wrote several books. And yeah, I will ask Albert to continue introducing himself and also to share your experience, Albert, with us. And then we will open for questions, and we will do the same with Chelsea and Christoph. Thank you so much for joining us today. Over to you, Albert.
Okay, good morning, or good afternoon or evening, depending where in the world you're coming in from. And I am here at the farm in Tennessee at the Ecovillage Training Center. It's part of our nonprofit organization called Global Village Institute that was created in 1974 here on the farm from a simple machine shop that made wind generators and Stirling engines. We were chartered as a tax-exempt charity in 1984 for the purpose of researching and disseminating promising new appropriate technologies and creative arts that work in friendly ways to heal the world. But since then, we've focused primarily, since I would say the mid-90s, we've been focused primarily on the nexus between reversing climate change and human behavior, which has taken us into the subjects that we're discussing today. The work that I'm most engaged in right now is our plan to pave the first mile of highway in North America with an alternative to asphalt from fossil carbon being replaced with biochar from bamboo and other local hardwood sources. And I'll speak more about that in a few minutes. But first, I want to just do some more in the way of kind of general introduction. And for me personally, what does climate mean? What do I want to do? What am I thinking about for myself, for my children, for my grandchildren, and their generation? What do I expect in the future, and how am I planning for it, right? So for me personally, climate action is to find a cool place to be when it's hot, and a warm place to be when it's cold, and a dry place to be when it's wet, and a well-hydrated place to be when it's dry. And if I put all of those four elements together in one place, well, that's the nature of eco-habitat design. And I believe that good design allows us to do just that across a wider spectrum of locations. And let me be very clear about this. I understand the need and urgency for many people to move out of areas that are being devastated by natural disasters caused by climate destruction. I really feel strongly that nowhere is safe. There is nowhere that is safe. And there is no one who will not be affected. And here's the eco-village part. You cannot adapt just yourself. You need a community effort. Your community will need to come to grips with migrants and climate refugees. You can expect food shortages. You need to protect your sources of water. You need to prepare for fires and ice storms and hurricanes and tornadoes. And you'll have to be able also to reach out and help others. I stayed up last night to 1 a.m. our time, which was just 8 a.m. in Stockholm, to watch the announcement of this year's Right Livelihood Award winners. I was thrilled when SOS Mediterranean won the prize, because they are truly heroic for going against governments and just putting out to sea and rescuing migrants in boats. And I'm cheering for them. I'm one of the main fundraisers for the Green Road Project that is resettling and caring for refugees from the war zone in Ukraine. We're placing them in eco-villages, and that's a tremendous service because so many of those migrants are children who have been traumatized by bombings and killings, and now their world will be reframed as a hopeful, good, happy future for everyone. And so, we can ask ourselves, what lessons the eco-villages have? How does this go mainstream? What lessons can be applied outside of the eco-villages? And of course, eco-villages select the best designs for living, and then they improve upon them by actual use. But those results are immediately transferable. One example is an attached greenhouse, the glass houses on sides of houses. That assists in passive heating in cold months. It also provides food from a climate-controlled environment that is less susceptible to extremes in weather. It's indoor gardening, I think, has a real future. Another example is the wasteful practice of keeping pets. Many eco-villages have learned how destructive that can be. There's 160 million domestic cats and dogs just in the United States, and they were responsible for 25 to 30% of the environmental impact of the meat consumed in this country. That's 64 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalents to the annual emissions. You know, that's like 13 million fossil-powered cars just from pets. So which would you rather have, a dog or a cat or 2 SUVs? Eco-villagers are more inclined to say neither, and that's something that can be widely adopted. And since I'm mentioning cars, let me bring it back to the idea I mentioned earlier, carbon roads. So here in the farm, we've been going, since the 1971, and we've paved our roads as time has gone on. Mostly in the first decade or two, we were dirt road, and we got the usual respiratory ailments from inhaling dust all the time in the summer and mud in the winter and all that. And gradually over time, we spent the money to pave a lot of our roads. Well, that's had consequences that we didn't immediately recognize. It's a continuing expense. And we intend now to switch to plant-based roads. We intend to pave the first biochar road here at our eco-village in Tennessee, and it will sequester 300 tons of biochar, which will erase the annual climate impact of 200 vehicles per year. The U.S. has, lots of roads and resurfacing every year. 350 million long tons of asphalt get poured in this country every year. So if everybody in this country substituted carbon roads, it would draw down 875 million tons of carbon dioxide per year. That's 12% of the USA's greenhouse gas emissions profile, more than that of 200 million vehicles. So more importantly, I think this market can potentially scale. It can scale biochar production faster than fertilizer. It can further incentivize the adoption of integrated agroforestry systems and further improve their climate impact and wildfire risk by reducing the decomposition of forestry waste. So to reduce emissions, we calculate the biochar, if we want to do these kinds of road projects, should be sourced as locally as possible. And that requirement means that scaling must come from smaller farm and forestry sources. And here our own bamboo will provide most of what we need. It's the fastest growing terrestrial plant, and we've got lots of it. So as we work with the local technological labs, the asphalt labs and the universities, the experimental data that we hope to gather is going to inform adjustments to civil engineering codes. That'll permit wide-scale adoption of, carbon negative paving. And we're nestled in a forest. So we're in a mixed mesophilic oak forest. We started with 1,700 acres of cattle farm in a prairie barrens. But over the last 50 years, we've expanded to nearly 20 square kilometers, and most of that is forested. We are a forest people. And we've been concerned about the climate question since at least the early to mid 1980s. My first book on the subject, Climate in Crisis, was published in 1990. When the farm was started in 1971, we had a pretty stable and predictable climate. The climate we had then is now located near Lexington, Kentucky. The climate we have now was down around Natchez, Mississippi back in 1971. Climate has been migrating poleward in our region about 70 miles per decade. So our forest is migrating. People talk about, heirloom seeds and heritage plants and invasives and things like that. Well, honestly, we are the midwives of the future forest because few forests can keep up with the change that's happening. And if the trees from farther south can't be replanted, then there will be no forest here, because the forest of this latitude is moving out. It's dying out. And in 2009, we hosted a week-long carbon farming course with great selection of instructors, including Darren Doherty and Brad Lancaster and Elaine Ingham and Eric Tonesmeyer and Joel Salatin. We mapped out a modified agroforestry plan set out to keyline our fields, and we keylined our pastures, and we otherwise added more water into our landscape. And it's important to understand that when we're pumping fossil water out of the ground and into these evaporative agricultural models, we're artificially adding water to the hydrological system that wasn't previously part of that cycle. And when you're doing conventional chemical monocultures, you're creating deserts. You're pumping up water for irrigation from previous geological eras, and it's not renewable on a human time scale. So taking that water out of the ground, putting it into the air, is also adding to the violent water behavior that we've been seeing in Italy and Germany and Greece and the Philippines and other places. Well, there's a remedy for that. Farms with 3% soil organic matter, including biochar, reduce water demand by 10%. Farms with 6 to 8% organic matter reduce water demand by 50%. Farms with 10 to 15% organic matter in soil reduce water demand by 75%. Farms that are well managed in their soils and how fertile and aerated those soils are absorb rain, so they don't flood, they store rain, and they recharge aquifers. So one of the things we did after we ran that course in 2009, we bought a keyline plow, we got some tanks, and we started brewing up compost teas. We bought some good microscopes to get better at it. We gradually ramped up to 1,000-gallon tanks. We used a fire hose to spray compost teas on pastures and orchards. We keylined. We added biochar soaked in affected microorganisms in the root zone. So during the last El Nino, those pastures and orchards withstood a 3-year drought. Those fields soaked up water, and there were no flooding event downpours, nothing flooded. The black soil profile is now 1 meter deep. It grazes horses for 6 months and then idles 3 months, and then we harvest the hay for winter. This is a very robust and regenerative land management system. During that drought, we could pasture our horses on those keyline fields, and the grass stayed green, and there was plenty of rotation. There was no worries or shortages. After all this land sculpting and terracing practices, rainwater, which is captured through swales and biochar and perennials on keyline and protected through evaporation, it pulls acidic water into the well-structured soil, and that acid creates chelation. It chelates minerals in the soil parent materials, and it releases those in a form that is then bioavailable to plants. And you get a rich web of fungi and microorganisms in the soil food web that's transporting and passing off to the nematodes on the roots of the plants. And the plants have all the food they want on demand, all the water they want on demand, and they grow healthy regardless of how bad the conditions are, how hot or cold it may be, whatever. So let me mention one other little known fact. We learned about this because we still farm large fields and we have lots of home vegetable gardens alongside roads. We learned that normal fossil bitumen comes from the crude sludge that's a waste product from oil refining. And it's a concentration of all the worst cancer-causing, toxic, birth defect-causing chemicals that you can imagine. A blacktop road leaches all of that constantly. Every rain sends some of it into the grass verges, the streams, and the rivers. Hot days heat up the surface and cause it to outgas, meaning you're breathing that stuff in. It's almost as bad as what comes from the tailpipe of a fossil car. It doesn't matter if you're biking or e-biking on that, you're still breathing it in. Well, biochar roads will do the opposite. They pull toxins out of the environment. They remove greenhouse gases. And think of how many new roads are built every year in China or Africa. And all of those could be plant-based. Biochar asphalt substitutes are 40% stronger, more durable, lower maintenance, and they're also cheaper to produce. So while we drink our tea here in the Eco-Village, we're changing the world. And I think there are other kinds of innovations that eco-villages contribute to reversing climate change. So I think one that's commonly mentioned is communications. It's the invisible architecture of community, nonviolent conflict management, holistic management. That's a process, not an end. It begins with forging a shared vision and then setting your collective intention. You have to self-govern with integrity and transparency, equality, and justice. Earth-sheltered natural buildings made of sturdy and renewable natural materials gathered immediately from that site is a responsible way to build buildings, but it's also healthy. And, like I mentioned, midwifing the future forest, learning how to use that regeneratively for food and forage and construction materials, fuel, and biochar to protect it, and protect it from pests, fires, and floods. Become a forest people. We need trillions more trees, right? So I urge that of everybody, is to plant trees. Switching to renewables will not solve climate change. Driving hybrids or electric cars will not stop the climate emergency. Eco-villages have to learn how to go beyond zero emissions and get to the stage of net drawdown, taking extra CO2 out of the atmosphere every year. And there are many inexpensive and beneficial ways to do that. Reforestation, bamboo groves, biochar, lime renders on their houses, and keyline watershed management. And I think the role of ReGen and other community networks in climate action is mainstreaming these concepts, having this conversation at the big boys table, going to major events and talking to heads of state and movers and shakers. And my personal experience with it is I don't spend much time in protest. I did that when I was young and pretty clueless. Now I prefer to get strategic, and I write books and blogs, and I lecture, and I talk to y'all, and I jump in and work on serious demonstration programs that have solutions that are viable. And I'm hoping out of this colloquium, we'll get a lot more emergency planetary technicians like me who roll up their sleeves and actually do stuff. And I'll leave it with that, Taisa.
Thank you. Thank you, Albert. Very, very good inputs. So we are going to open the floor for questions, comments, reflections, whoever is ready to go.
There was one question in the chat.
Okay.
Ian asked where to get all the biomass to make all that biochar for roads.
You just muted.
Yeah. Okay. So from the standpoint of scaling this, there's already ample supply of waste material. For instance, I sourced it out, even though we have plenty of biochar in my eco-village from bamboo. I sourced it out if we wanted to work with our county to start paving county roads. There's a place near us, a very short distance over in Lynchburg, Tennessee, near the Jack Daniel's distillery. And they take the old whiskey barrels from the distillery and turn those into biochar. And he said he could get me hundreds of tons of biochar that he had from those whiskey barrels. And that's good oak biochar. There are forest wastes, there are municipal solid wastes. The thing about the roads is it doesn't have to be as pure as biochar for fertilizer. So it might have microplastics, which means you could use seaweed, which has microplastic contamination, to make this kind of biochar for roads. You could have heavy metals, is what you get in municipal solid waste a lot. And if you have a little shredded heavy metal in there, that's okay for a roadway also. It doesn't have to be as pure as it has to be for, say, water filtration or fertilizer. So there's plenty of biomass in the moment. Now, when you get to the scale of pulling tens of gigatons per year out of the atmosphere, that's when you begin to run into shortfalls in feedstocks. What are you going to use to make the biochar? Because there's only so much biomass on the planet. And how much can you photosynthesize in 1 year? But if you look at the 3/4 of the planet that's ocean, now you can start to farm the ocean with kelp forests, which you actually need to put back the whale populations and to create carbon dioxide removal in the ocean. Those forests have been devastated, been desertified over industrial era. Now those kelp forests should be put back. And if you farm those kelp forests for food and other products, bio oils and things, you can then take the waste product from that process and turn that into biochar. So you got a huge source there, virtually unlimited source. And then you've got other sources that, if you get back into reforestation on a large scale, you've got woody wastes that can come out of the process from making lumber and making furniture and things like that out of the forest, from agroforestry waste, from orchard waste, from vineyard waste, all of those things that are currently mostly just burned, or they're left to decompose and become methane in the atmosphere. All of that can now be diverted into a useful, profitable product that can be put into these new ideas like construction.
Thank you, Albert. We have another question on the chat. Do you recommend books about climate impactful agriculture?
Well, the first books I'm going to recommend are my own. And one of those is Burn, which is this book. Get it into focus. It's try to get it into focus. It doesn't want to focus. It only wants to focus on me. That's the Zoom algorithm, right? So
we can share the link.
Doesn't work. Anyway, this book is with a little cover blurb here by Paul Hawken. This is Igniting a New Carbon Drawdown Economy to End the Climate Crisis. And it tells about all the things you can do with biochar other than farming. All the different products that you can have, like bioplastics that unzip when they're exposed to seawater, things like that. And how you actually make profit doing that. I have another book that I did back in 1990 called Climate in Crisis. And this was with a foreword by Senator Al Gore back in 1990, that this told the history of, or the story of climate science. And I wouldn't change a word of that today. It had a couple thousand footnotes, but it still is pretty accurate today. In 2009, I think, I did this book called The Biochar Solution. And this was after I visited the rainforest in the Amazon and got to see the original Terra Preta do Indio, the original soils of the Indians in Brazil. And they created a technique there that made those soils so fertile that after 1,000 years, they're getting bagged up and sold in gardening stores to the soils. That's how fertile they are. And this is an ancient technique of how to create soil fertility. If you look at the world's deserts, the places where agriculture originated, northern China, northern Africa, the Fertile Crescent, those today are deserts. And that's because of irrigation and the plow, a technique of agriculture that kept expanding and expanding until it just left deserts behind. If you look at the Americas, the Western Hemisphere, North and South, they used a combination of soil technology like canals, chinampas, biochar, and forestry and agroforestry, and getting food from the forest that built up soil profiles to meters and meters deep. And so behind that style of agriculture was left these gorgeous, deep, rich, fertile places, as opposed to the deserts on the other side of the world. So we have to learn from that indigenous practice and change agriculture over from the old style that makes deserts to the new style. And this is what I say, you know, it's good to take care of migration and good to help with refugees, but let's try to make places where refugees don't have to leave. Let's try to regenerate soils and regenerate landscapes and regenerate ecosystems so that those places are as lush and fertile as any place they might hope to go. And I think we can do that. I think we know how to do that. And we know certain things that accelerate that process. Certainly permaculture gives you all those tools. And that's my vision of it.
Thank you so much. And maybe we move on to the last question. How optimistic are you about the future? What do you expect the world to look like in, let's say, 2040? Or do you wish?
Yeah, this is a dangerous question to ask someone like me, because I don't get depressed, but I'm a carrier. And people around me get very depressed because I don't cut any slack when I tell them that by 2040, we're going to be in a lot worse condition than we are today. That we have to pass through this bottleneck point in human evolution now. And we're going to come out on the other side, either we're going to become extinct and probably Homo sapiens will be extinct, or we will evolve into something new, an eco-human form that is more in harmony with natural systems and the Earth's normal cycles. And regenerative in the sense that we rebuild and go back to the comfortable Holocene in which humans evolved. And this crunch point is going to take us through 2040. You know, I am sad for my granddaughter, for what she's going to experience. On the other hand, I hope to equip her with the tools to be able to have grandchildren of her own. And that's the eco-village science part of it. And that's what we do is here in the eco-village world, is to create those tools, to explore them, to actually live them, which is the real test, and then to transport and get those out into the larger society. And I think that's really the only hope. I don't have a lot of hope from the standpoint of current human behavior is so determined and so predisposed by, you know, bad microbiome maintenance and memes that are multi-generational and politics that's toxic and you know, the social media that's toxic and algorithms that are destructive and AI and a lot of other stuff. But, you know, that superorganism is like a comic book villain, and we can defeat it if we band together and work on becoming superheroes ourselves. And I think that's still possible. So I still hold out a glimmer of hope that my granddaughter will have children of her own, and they will have children of their own, and they will have a much better life by the time we get through the transition that we're going through now.
Thank you so much, Albert. Well, I think we could continue in this direction, but as we have other guests, I just want to pause here for now and thank you so much for your initial inputs. And I will invite Schelly to join us in this conversation. Schelly is a professor of sociology in the Department of Social Science at Michigan Technological University. She has researched and written about a wide array of alternative technologies and material systems that lessen the negative impacts of modern life, including renewable energy, technology adaptation, policies that support it, intentional communities, living off-grid, and so on. So I will open the floor to you, Schelly. Please further introduce yourself and share your initial ideas and experience on the topic.
Thank you for inviting me to participate in this event today, and thank you, Albert, for getting us started and the really rich remarks there. I'm a sociologist by training. That means I'm a scientist of social groups, so I won't get into the technical benefits of biochar, but we'll be thinking more about the social organization of eco-villages and some of my kind of thoughts there on how that relates to the potential for collective action coming out of these spaces. And I was going to try to find a map. I'm not sure that I can easily. I just want to give some context. I work at Michigan Technological University, which is the engineering college of Michigan in the United States, but I live in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So my house is technically on an island in the middle of Lake Superior. I live in a community that is marked by extreme rurality. I am 4 hours plus from the nearest US interstate. So the work that I do and the community in which I work is characterized by very rural community, sometimes described as its own intentional community because most people end up here on purpose. It's not some place that people live just because they happen to be here, unless they grew up here, of course. But I also want to acknowledge that I'm writing and working in a US perspective. And so that might, there's lots of opportunity for us to think about how your experiences or your engagement are very different from my own. And I also just want to highlight that here in the UP, I am living on the ancestral and contemporary homelands of the Anishinaabe people, and I learn a lot from working with the original inhabitants of this land. I position myself and think of myself as a learner in this space, and thinking about what the Ojibwe peoples and their traditions and their cultures, which is a very vibrant culture here, have to teach us when we think about alternative practices and alternative ways of knowing and being. So wanted to start there. I have been here at Michigan Tech since 2013. And I also wanted to give a little bit of my own intellectual background. I think it's helpful for understanding the work that I do. I grew up in what I would consider like quintessential suburbia USA. I grew up in a community with named neighborhoods with sidewalks to nowhere and very little intentionality that felt right to me anyway, and went to college, went to university, and had 2 female sociology professors in my first year and said, oh, you can do that for a living. I'm going to go do that for a living. So I have known for most of my life at this point that I wanted to work as a social scientist in the social science space. And really my first inspiration was understanding that the things that I saw around me in the environment where I grew up didn't feel right to me, and really thinking about that relationship between how we engage with Earth systems to meet our needs and comforts, and thinking about the exploitation of those Earth systems and those communities of life as deeply tied to the exploitation of human beings. And so that was really the inspiration, I think, for me, starting with an understanding that if we don't change how we meet our needs and comforts, we will never change how we relate to one another, because both are characterized by exploitative relationships at their core. And so my first interests were in alternative technology adoption, and I've done that work in a wide variety of contexts. From solar adoption, people putting solar panels on their houses, to the use of 3D printers and how that changes our relationship with consumption, and in spaces of eco-villages and intentional communities. And I want to share, if I can, I just got a new computer and it's very confusing for me, but I'm going to try to share in the chat a link to a book, not because I want you to go buy that book, but because I want you to understand a little bit of the context of how I have engaged with intentional communities and eco-villages here in the United States. The work that was a part of my early scholarly activity in this space was really focused on technology. So thinking about how are people organizing their built environment? How are they meeting their needs for energy and water? How are they organizing transportation systems? And so really thinking specifically about the socio-technical or infrastructural systems that support life in eco-villages. And again, what is that relationship between the way we organize our material systems and the way that we organize our social systems? And much of what that work came to highlight for me is is really focused in sort of theories of social practice and understanding. And again, I'm going to bring the academic perspective into this, so I'll try to unpack some of those phrases. So thinking about social practices as mostly our habitual and unthinking and routine patterns of behavior, and really kind of trying to flip on its head the way that we understand motivations for action. So for many, many years, and social scientists, sociologists, economists, many others studying human behavior suggested that we calculate, whether that's through kind of rational cost-benefit analysis or through value-laden understandings, but that we're calculating our decisions based on whatever our intention might be, and that our action is derived from those calculations, again, whether it's about our economics or our values, whatever it might be. Theories of social practice and pragmatist ways of knowing really flip that on its head and say that it's by doing that we change what we're thinking. So rather than seeing thought as the precursor to action, saying that it's the actions that we're engaging in that change what we think of as the conditions of what's possible. And so for me, that's a really big part of what I see as the potential for eco-villages, is recognizing that people are already doing differently in these spaces, which opens up conditions of possibility for what can be done differently. And many eco-villages are also engaged in active visitor programs or other kinds of educational outreach. And it's in the experience of doing differently that people learn to think differently. So it's, we're not going to change people's values, but we can change their behaviors, and that will shape the way that they think about their world and their relationship to it. So it really changes that perspective. I think another piece that comes out of this is recognizing that people engage or have the potential to engage in very similar behaviors for very different values. And in fact, in many eco-villages that I have engaged with, people there don't share values in terms of the primary motivation for why they might be living there, right? So it might be focused on the eco, or it might be focused on the village. It might be focused on kind of thinking about changing your practice to align with environmental values or with social values of connectivity, or changing how you relate to the economy, and that it doesn't actually matter so much what that primary motivation is, because people are engaging in the same kinds of behaviors. And particularly in the US context, where we see a lot of divisiveness and differences across value systems, I think that that can be quite motivating to recognize that if people are engaging in the same kinds of behaviors, and we can facilitate opportunities to change behavioral practice, we can stop worrying so much about whether or not people share the same values. And that in fact, even in eco-village spaces, people might be coming to the same practices with a very different set of value orientations that are motivating those practices. Some more recent work that I've been engaged with that I wanted to share as well really takes on this question directly of collective action. And this will be familiar for some of you. I'm going to share a preprint in the chat as well, so you can access it there. And thinking about eco-villages as sites of collective action, recognizing that collective action in the US context might often look like consumptive choices, as Albert talked about, right? We might try to buy our way to a more sustainable future by changing the kinds of things that we purchase. That collective action also, as Albert highlighted, can sometimes look like political mobilization, participating in protests or other forms of political collective action in that way. And that in this work, and really the reflections I'd want to offer for discussion here, are thinking about some of the challenges, but also opportunities for eco-villages to engage in collective action if we situate those eco-villages in their relationships to their geospatial neighbors in a community. And so many of the eco-villages where I've worked, there's a chapter on the farm in the work that I shared. Many of them are located in rural communities, and they're about changing relationships to land management practices, the built environment, energy, water, and transport in these rural spaces. And so we highlight in this paper what we call these paradoxes, what might be seen as like these dialectic push and pulls, right? Where we see a sort of both and I want to highlight a couple of those. And again, for me, the big picture point is that eco-villages are geospatially situated. They're located within counties or townships or states or regions or whatever kind of community context you'd like to put on it, and that the extent to which they're engaging in collective action and the various ways that we might think about that are shaped by those relationships. So recognizing that eco-villages are both enabled and constrained by the context around them. And so studying eco-villages without that kind of contextualization, I think, might limit our ability to think about what role they play in collective action for climate change. The first paradox that we point out in this paper and that I want to highlight here is recognizing sort of the paradox of personal choice, as we call it or think about it, that many eco-villages do actually involve, I'm going to quote Garrett Hardin, maybe in a less than familiar way. Garrett Hardin is used to argue that we shouldn't have common pool resources, but because we can't possibly manage them. But there's a key phrase that he uses in that early critical work around mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon, and that we argue that eco-villages actually are sites of mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon, where people's personal choices might be limited in certain ways that people are agreeing to and collectively buying into, but that make it more difficult to translate those lessons to contexts where we aren't having conversations that are critical around personal choice. So some of the communities where I've worked might limit what kinds of building materials you can use, whether you can own a personal vehicle, even when and how and if you can have children. Those all feel like very constraining features, but for people who live in eco-villages, they aren't constraining, they're actually empowering or enabling, and they're things that they agree to. Outside of the eco-village context, we also have a lot of constraints on our personal freedoms here in the United States. There are homeowners associations that limit what you can do with your lawn, whether you can have a clothesline in your backyard, all sorts of things. But we don't tend to have critical conversations around the ways that our lives are shaped by those constraints, and whether or not personal choice is actually empowering or enabling. In many of the contexts where I've worked, people from eco-villages say, you know, I want to have somebody tell me what to build my house out of because it's stressful to have so many choices and not know which ones are good. It's better if somebody has already figured out this is the most ecologically responsible choice you could make for this environment. And so it's actually empowering to have those limitations rather than limiting. And so that's one of the paradoxes that we point out, is that for eco-villages, this constraint on personal choice is not seen as a limitation, but is seen as an empowerment. But outside of the context of eco-villages, we aren't having critical conversations about personal choice, the extent to which we have it, whether or not it's actually freeing. And so that makes it difficult to translate some of those lessons from an eco-village context outside to broader collective action. The other sort of paradox that we point out is that while some of the eco-villages where myself and my co-authors have worked do create the structural conditions that would enable certain forms of collective action, perhaps you're less worried about paying your rent or making sure you have enough to eat. It's not based on this economic dependence, or maybe in a labor sharing, income sharing community where they're quantifying more of the domestic work that right now we don't count as work. And so they have more hours actually in their day for other things. So both the having more time, the having less dependency on monetary forms of economics, also having access to vehicles, all of these things can be limiting the barriers to participation in conventional forms of collective action like political protest or mobilization. But we argue that just because the conditions are there doesn't mean that people take opportunities to do those things, right? So we might see environments where people are less dependent on, you know, kind of full-time work to meet their economic needs and full-time domestic duties to take care of a home. They might be less dependent on those things. They might have more of the structural conditions that would support engagement, but that doesn't mean that people are choosing to engage. That doesn't mean that they're, you know, whether it's collective action to volunteer for local climate mobilization chapters or join protests, that kind of action isn't always happening, even when we see the structural conditions to do so. And I do want to point out that for us, a lot of this work was happening pre-2020 in the United States, or so thinking about what that means for that argument in its temporal context. There might be more urgency around mobilization now than there was when we were doing some of our ethnographic work. The third paradox that we point out is really this idea that good neighbors don't make waves, and that particularly in the United States, these rural eco-villages are often located in communities that are more traditionally conservative, emphasizing tradition or religion, other forms of culture. And that means that there are cases in which eco-villages are actively changing the ways that they engage with the outside community to make sure that they're building good relationships with their neighbors, right? So while they might be engaged in really innovative forms of waste management or sustainable building, they might not necessarily highlight that, lest they get the attention of a local building zoning coordinator, building code enforcer. Even things like changing the style of dress when they're entering into the local community, leaving the eco-village and entering into, these are all ways that eco-villages, members of eco-villages are choosing to change the way that they engage so that they maintain positive relationships with those rural neighbors. But that also means that they might not always be as vocal or as active in local politics in the ways that would align with the more progressive values around climate action or collective action to address climate. And so just recognizing again that putting eco-villages into their spatial context and how they're relating to the neighbors and the communities around them, I think is important for being able to ask this question about the extent to which they're having an impact that can move beyond the boundaries of the eco-village to really address climate change and regeneration at the scale and the pace that would really be necessary to build these futures, right, where we have a future for humanity to live in a way that is providing quality of life. And I guess I want to end with a couple of things. One is that I don't mean to criticize eco-villages as sites of radical action at all. I recognize that what's happening within eco-villages is often giving us those living laboratories and those experimental models of what can and should be happening more broadly. And there's a lot that we can learn from those spaces. I think that understanding the translation to broader action outside of the eco-village boundary requires that we recognize those relationships, but I don't mean to dismiss the impact that eco-villages are having. I also think that this question of relationality and thinking about eco-villages in relation to their neighboring geospatial context is also really, could be really helpful for informing work thinking about those ecosystem impacts as we think about, what are the benefits of soil regeneration or permaculture as building soils or waters or carbon drawdown potentials. All of those ecosystems are also, the ecosystem of the eco-village is located within a broader ecosystem. And so figuring out how do we parse what's going on the eco-village scale, what impact it can have, I think there's also some benefit to thinking in that relational kind of context. And then I just wanted to share one more link, if I can, really came up in what Albert was saying in terms of optimism about the future. I think one of the things that I'm most optimistic about in terms of our potential for collective action is really the opportunity that we have to push back and say that a failure of modernity is not a failure of humanity. And these ideas that we've had about what makes us what builds successful lives or what builds meaning for humans doesn't have to be tied to continual progress or these ideas that we've seen that really separate humans from nature and then try to control nature for scientific purposes, all of these ideas that came out of what we now would think of as modernity. And there's an academic network that I think is really amenable to taking on these ideas called the Planetary Limits Academic Network, which is a space where people are recognizing the need to contend with planetary limits and to recognize limits not as a failure or a negative, but as a way that we can engage as just one member of the global communities of life and think about humans' roles in that world a little bit differently. And I guess that's one thing I will say is that in practice, eco-villages provide a space where we can challenge that separation between humans and nature. And it's through those practices that I think they have the most radical potential. And that links back to what I said about how I think of social change and the ability to make change is that if we provide more opportunity for alternative practices, I think we'll have more potential to change the way that people prioritize and make decisions. And that's some of the real potential I see for eco-villages as sites of collective action. Yeah, I welcome questions and conversation. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Very, very good inputs. So the floor is open for questions, comments, reflections. You can either put it on the chat or just raise your hand and open your mic.
Well, I'll just start by saying thank you very much. I was racing to keep up to your thought process verbalized, but I'd like to apply that. I live on a small farm, permaculture based, for 15, 20 years now. But I like this idea that nature bats last, and your notion. I want to just link that as an observation, that this idea that of mutual constraints, mutually agreed upon, is one of the paradoxes living in community. Well, we do live in a community called the ecosphere, and it's constraining, and we're not agreeing to it. So we're out of line. We're seriously out of line, and maybe we need to. That would be fun to try to figure out how to model the permaculture. I mean, the eco-village experience on a as on a global scale. That's all.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That for me is really related to that idea that we tend to see limits as something we should be circumventing or somehow getting over, rather than living in relation to those limits, right? The number of hours of daylight is a limit. The extent to which we can breathe underwater is a limit. Some of these limits we take and just accept, right? And we don't try to surpass them, although maybe in technological kind of futurism we do. But it also for me relates to the ideas of relations with the earth and consent-based relations with the earth. And one of the conversations I have with colleagues in this planetary limit space is about moving away from the language of resources, which suggests that there are things here for humans to use, and thinking more about sources of life or consent-based relationships. And I think for me, all of that fits into whether we think of those limits as inherently negative or a part of what it means to be a member of the community of life, not as a good or a bad, but just a part of membership in this community of life, is accepting the limits, which again, that might be the wrong phrase, really the relations, right? We're entering into relations, and how do we live in consent-based relations? And I appreciate this idea that nature bats last, right? That those are immutable, right? The biophysical limits are themselves immutable. And any suggestion that we can navigate our way around them with human ingenuity, I would say, is false at best.
Thank you. One more question for Chelsea at this point, and we can move on. I really loved the piece about the behavior change, and that we can do it once we kind of put our hands on it. And
yeah. One of the eco villages I work with or have worked with in the past uses a very simple system of humanure composting, and every visitor who comes says the hardest thing about the visitor program is going to be 3 weeks of pooping in a bucket. And every time at the end of the 3 weeks they say, why do we flush water, potable water down a toilet, right? Like it only takes 3 weeks. And really there's a lot of research on behavior change that it suggests it's a pretty short amount of time of being exposed to a new practice where people are comfortable accepting that practice. And there is a question in the chat about creation of eco villages and promoting that. And I think that's a big part of it, is that opening opportunities for that, those experiments with alternative ways of living and creating that space. And so that's, part of that is on eco villages to have those visitor programs or to find ways to do educational work in that way. Some of that is on our kind of broader cultures. How do we create cultures of care where people can take 3 weeks to go experience something different? So there's not just the responsibility of eco villages, I would say, to do that, but works, on kind of both sides of that relation. But then once people have the experience, as a social scientist, I always think about the data that I wish I had, and I would love to know kind of post eco-village visitation experience, do visitors consider that empowering or some way less than empowering, because they go back to whatever their context might be and then realize all of the barriers they might face in trying to create that radical change for themselves, right? Where they might recognize there are much better ways to manage organic waste, but they live in a place that requires a septic tank because of building codes or those kinds of things. So do they see it as empowering, or is it in some ways an exercise of frustration? I think that would be very interesting data to collect. But I think the combination of new experiences where people see what's possible and then very localized advocacy for changing building codes, changing zoning requirements, changing the things that limit our ability to engage with these alternative practices, I think those things in tandem are really important for creating more spaces where people can engage with these alternatives.
Thank you, Chelsea. Thank you so much. And I think very soon we will have all the project outputs available. And part of it is a platform with a matchmaking system where we'll be able to see, for example, eco-villages that are looking for volunteers on a specific topic, or that are looking for academics to study this or that, and who could support, what kind of universities or professors are studying that topics or have more inputs, what should we put our energy on, like supporting and so on. So yeah, you will hear from us very soon. Thank you so much. And let's pause for now, because I want to introduce you our third guest speaker, Christoph Strünke. I'm so glad you made it, Christoph. Christoph had some tech issues, but he's here with us. Let me briefly introduce you. Christoph has been living and working in Sieben Linden, Ecovillage in Germany for 21 years. He studied cultural sciences with a focus on ecology and environmental education. He's responsible for the ecological aspects of the ecovillage, including the calculation of the community ecological footprint. So the floor is open to you, Christoph, and very welcome.
Yes, hello. Just at first, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
That's fine, because with this laptop, I cannot change a lot of things. Hopefully, we'll get through it fine. And yeah, I'm glad that finally it worked. And well, I will present now information about the Ecovillage Sieben Linden and about the footprint of Sieben Linden, and also refer that to the aspect of what it means to live communal, not only living in a community or an intentional community, but to live communal to get somehow things done in order of climate change or in climate action. And I would like to present my information while having this PowerPoint, and I tried to do this to make this. Is that fine for me?
Are you able to do it from this computer?
I think so. I will see.
Yeah, I made you a co-host already.
So can you see something?
Yes, we can.
Is it fine for you to see?
I'm not sure if there is a way to make it like full screen so we could see one slide at a time.
Let me see. Well, do you see all of it at the moment, or what?
Yeah, we see all of it at the moment.
Maybe like this.
Oops, now we can see just a part of it.
Okay. And we'll see. No, that doesn't work.
This is the best, or let's see if almost presentation mode, or just present.
Yeah, well, I was starting at the moment. I started it, but then you didn't see anything somehow.
Okay.
But you see also all of it at the moment. You don't see.
Yeah, I think it's possible to see it like this, or if you'd like.
Yeah, otherwise we can do it. Yeah. Let's see if do you have it open?
Okay. So as I live now in Ecovillage for 20 years now, I have realized at one point that the most important thing for us to have a rather low ecological footprint is that we act communally, and not only living in a communal in a community and in a community, but also to act together on things. And I will give some examples for that. And firstly, I'd like to share a quote. It's from Lynn Margulis. She said, if we were to survive the man-made ecological and social crisis, we would find ourselves constrained to get involved in totally new and dramatic community enterprises and projects. So we cannot do it on your own, and you cannot do it just maybe like as a family. You will have to do it in a more wider range of community, whatever that means then. And now, Sieben Linden Eco-Village, we are situated in the north of Germany.
I think maybe, can I stop you for a while, because it's a bit small.
Okay,
so
and I try to make it, is it better now?
I can try to share mine.
Yes, much better now. And I think you probably have down there something to put it on full screen.
Yeah, well, if I do full screen, I realize that I don't see you anymore.
Yeah. But I think this way,
So
is
maybe,
it okay for all of you?
Does it work like
that's
this?
it. Perfect. Thank you so much, and sorry for interrupting.
That's okay? Okay.
That's perfect.
So this is, as you see, it's we are situated in the north of Sieben Linden. And the first ideas were in '89, and we realized the project in '97. So it's now 26 years that it exists in Saxony-Anhalt, so in the new areas of Germany. You can see our picture. We are about 145 people at the moment. A lot of children, youth, what is very special for this region, as it is a quite old region somehow. And here you see we are situated. We have at the moment 115 hectares. The most of it is forest. And do you see the pointer? Can you see the pointer? Yeah, and so most of the forest is north from here. You cannot see it in the moment. This is south, this is north, and this is the settlement area. And it's the garden. And yeah, this is the most important things. We have also arable land, but it's not, you cannot see it here. Well, some of it here for horses to live there, to grow, but mostly is somewhere else you cannot see it. And what is very, very important for us to make it that you can live, that the living takes part in the village again, not that the people live there or sleep there and go away from 9 to 6 or so and be there only in the evenings or in the weekends, but that we have a living at the moment every day in the eco-village. And this has to do that you need to have working options, that people work inside the eco-village. Otherwise, it would not work like that. And most very important for us to have small circles and extensive self-sufficiency. So this is our main aspects. And in 2018, we had scientists who did an ecological footprint, a land footprint and a carbon footprint for us, and also considering the public services. And there's also a link to the study. It's open source. You can have a look at it. It's also written in English. And at first I show the results, and then I get to the points. How do we get to the results? Now you see that in Germany it's about 9 tons per person, excluding the public services, only what is their own impact. And in Sieben Linden you see it's almost 1/4. And unfortunately, I could only have a slide in German language. Maybe you can realize Ernährung means nutrition. It's food. It's the green one. So that's about 1/3 of the average in Germany. Then mobility, transport is about 50%. So it's the worst of us, as we are in a very rural area, and we also drive with cars to get to job for people who job outside, who work outside. Then we have only about 10% in comparison of goods and residual waste. so very less waste. And also with energy, it's 10%. So you see, altogether we come to 30%. Still, it's not sustainable. No, you see, we would need we would get like the small food there, but it's one question of us. How could we get from there to there, or how do we want to encourage people to come from there to there? No, come from the big food to maybe a food like ours. This is an important question. Yeah, so we have a lot of photovoltaic panels, all of our energy, excluding the cooking energy. So, but heating and electricity is renewable on with the solar power and with woods from our own forests. And for us, it's sustainable as we grow more wood, the forest grows faster than we get the wood out of the forest to heat it, to use it for burning. And what is important that our consumption is about 60% according to the heating energy, and about 30% according to the electricity. But the heating energy, it comes at the moment here. You can see it's about 2/3, but maybe even less. Yeah, and you know, this is and it comes from our own forest, the wood. So. And as the former speaker said, we have only composting toilets, so we don't use water. So, and this compost is converted then into precious earth and precious earth, well, soil, you could say, that we use then for plantations. So, and we have our own biological seedbed. And as we only use composting toilets, we have a water consumption of 50%. So this makes a lot of water if you flush your your shit, I would say, or your feces down. So this is important for us, that we don't have only little reed beds, not so big ones. One of our also very important things is about growing food. We have a self-sufficiency of 70% on vegetables throughout the whole year. That means we have to store a lot of vegetables from November till April, May, as we don't grow or almost don't grow anything at that moment. And that means that there are tomatoes 2 months a year. Now we're getting to the end at the moment to tomatoes, and it's clear and it's fine. And it's this, I think, it means you get it more. You appreciate more the food if you don't get it throughout the whole year. And so I think that's the way how we should deal in the future. And one thing. What is very important about the dairy and food and meat products, you can see that the blue one is the milk products in Germany, and the red one is the milk products in Sieben Linden, so it's 50%. And even more, you can see the meat in Germany was 6 years ago about more than 80 kilogram per person in year, and here you can hardly see it. It's 600 gram, or maybe you could say it's 1 kilogram, but that makes a lot of this reduction on 30% according to the ecological footprint, as we consume much less on meat and also less on milk products or dairy products. Then we build with wood, clay, and straw bales. So, and we have these straw bales for insulation. And so we have you can compost the house if you like, apart from maybe the technical things in there. And yeah, it's insulation that where CO2 is still you don't need to produce it really, and you don't need to make a fire to get the insulation. So it binds CO2 to have the straw bales. Our somehow worst point in the ecological footprint is the mobility transport system. We have around 35 cars for 145 people. They can be borrowed, and we have only little flying, but still there is. And there's also communication and discussion sometimes in the community if it's okay still to fly. So, what is, I think, interesting, especially as we live in a very rural area, that we have, you can see the blue one is Sieben Linden, and the red one is Germany. That with cars, it's 1/4 of kilometers, as there are 12,000 kilometers in German average and 4,000 in Sieben Linden. And the other way around, if you have trains or the public service nearby, it's four times, no? As in blue, it's 4,000 kilometers. So we drive a lot, the same amount with cars than we go with trains. And this is for a rural area very unusual, because usually you don't need the cars in cities, but you need the cars if you live in a rural area. And what is also important, we have, of course, a place where it's a giveaway corner, and we have an email system that if I look for a new tent, maybe somebody has a tent that I can have, that I don't have to buy it anymore. So we have these big baskets now, where maybe that's also our own herb tea is in there. So you see 10 of them. So if you have to imagine, you would have to buy them in the shop, you would have much more of waste, than according to that, or in comparison to there. So we have a tenth or 10% in the footprint of residual waste and goods, because we don't produce so much waste. So again, you can see it here, and now you can also see what is very important and also a bit frustrating, I would say. You have the public services, so the schools, libraries, hospitals, all this what is public, and still this is already also 4 tons. Only this is 4 tons. So we have only 2.4 tons of our own footprint, and then you have 4 tons of public services. And there are other other scientists that say it's less than 4 tons. Maybe it's 1 or 2 tons, the public services. So the scientists are not do not agree on each other on that part. So, and here you can see it in numbers. But as I said, it's 10% with energy, goods, and waste, and with travel 50%, food 30%, and services. Of course, we take the same as everybody. So, and that's now come to my my aspects on a higher level about that. If we want to act sustainable, we have a lot of problems, because it's a cost disadvantage. No? If I want to go to Spain, it's much less, much cheaper to fly than if I would take the train. Then of course also often the infrastructure is, for example, especially on rural areas for mobility, is not very good. And
I'm gonna turn the mute off here.
Is it okay? Yeah. Somebody else. And yeah, you often don't know what is the right thing to do, because there's insufficient transparency and information. Then we have the advertising industry. We have the standard option. You have to choose to make renewable energy as an energy supplier, but you don't get it in general. And yeah, other aspects. And so what are our responses on that? We have ecological building criteria. You can only build a house if you use renewable energy, renewable things. And on every house there is solar collector. And for example, a small group decides on the food choices. So I don't have to decide every day when I go to a market what is the best option. But there are 4 or 5 people. They're also paid for that. They have a look. What is the best option ecological way? Then of course, what I said, we share materials. We lend and give away. Of course, as we have a rich communal living, we don't need so much material. We don't need to buy so much because we just live as a community, and we can also have a lot high immaterial prosperity. Then, yeah, of course, also what is sometimes very difficult, we have the ecological communication. What is the best to do? And of course, if somebody flies, he don't want somebody else to say you should not fly. So that's not the way to deal with it. But if we talk about the things, maybe the things change at a time. So, and I think well, this is the source references, and well, you can have the slides. I can send it to you, or I've already sent it to Tessa and the others. So it's possible also to get this. I think that's it. So that was a rough rushing through Sieben Linden Ecovillage. And so if you have, well, maybe what is for me really important to have these community responses. And you can have that also if you live somewhere else in a city or in a rural area. You just have to find a group, and then to think about that. How can we manage together to make it more ecological, our living? Okay, that's it.
Thank you so much, Christoph. Very inspiring. Maybe we can just come back to the group. If you can stop sharing your screen.
I think
And we are ready for questions. We can hear 1 or 2 questions. Perfect. If there are, or reflections, comments. I saw one question from Alex at the beginning, but maybe you have one, Chelsea.
I do, yeah, thank you, if that's okay. I have a question specifically around sharing, because I would absolutely agree that sharing is one of our biggest potentials, I suppose, for a more responsible future. But sharing often involves having to navigate conflict in some way, whether it's 2 people wanting something at the same time or miscommunications. I guess I'm wondering if you can give us any examples or tips on how to navigate shared access and the potential conflicts that might arise when you're sharing in the ways that you're proposing.
Yeah. Well, of course, there are conflicts, and it doesn't have to do with any ecological way of living. If you live together with a group of 140 people, of course, there will be conflicts. And well, I say that every time that somebody comes into the Ecovillage, he will grow somehow, and also in how to deal with conflicts. So of course, if there's a conflict, you have to speak with each other, and you should not write a mail, because if you write a mail, it will probably become worse. So we learn about that, and so yeah, well, I think it's really as basic as it is to talk about the things, and also to find out what are the really needs that the person has, and how can we deal with that. And yeah, well, it's of course, for example, if there is a conflict between 2 people and they cannot solve it at the moment, so then we have people who can join the 2, and you speak much different if there's a third person who hears what you're saying. And so this is also one very simple tool that we use a lot of times. So I think it's really about yeah, growing personally to speak about the conflicts. So
Thank you. And we have another 2 questions here on the chat. Let me voice them at the same time, and then you can respond. So, how open Sieben Linden is to new members and volunteers is the first one.
Mhm.
And the second, are you guys in contact to similar, oh, sorry, not this one. Do you have any support from the government? Oops, sorry, I'm trying to get there. What grants, funding, and government support have this eco-village received, and what is the relations with the local government?
Mhm. Okay, hopefully I remember the second question. Starting with the first question, is of course we are open for new members. We want to grow. We want to grow until maybe 300 people at most. So every 2-3 years we build a new house that people can come. And it takes a while until people come. They have to attend courses to get to know Sieben Linden, and also to get to know how it is to live communal. As the speaker or the asker before has pointed out about the conflicts. It's in these courses you learn also somehow to deal with conflicts, and how can you attend? How can you attend them? And and then people are very happy to very welcome to join Sieben Linden if there is place to live. This is also often the point, that as we have to build the houses that where people can come. You cannot come just now, because your living space has to be built before. So, and volunteers, we have a lot of volunteers each year. We have somehow in the German aspect of volunteers about 5-6, and then we have about 3-4 European volunteers who are in Sieben Linden for 6 months until 1.5 years. So it changes, and often people who attend the year, the voluntary year. Often they stay then in Sieben Linden and somehow manage to make their living. So it's quite nice. Because of that, we have a lot of also young people who live in Sieben Linden, so in the age of 20 to 35 or so. And then about the grants we don't have general grants. It's just we always have to finance it ourselves, but with special buildings, for example, we get then support, financial support from the government if we make it somehow more, to say, if you make something new and it will be interesting for the public, then we get a grant for that. And sometimes special projects. For example, there was a project that also I lead it the last 6 years. That was about the cooperation of eco-villages to villages, to normal or conventional villages nearby. And this project, these projects were financed from the Umweltbundesamt. So it's an organization in Germany from the ministry. So special projects we get grants, but not for the normal existence or for normal ways of living. So
Thank you. Thank you so much, Christoph, for being with us. And there's a question from Alex I want to ask the 3 of you before we move on to a more participatory process. He's asking us if the eco-village model is replicable, if it could be implemented at a large scale. You want to start, Christoph, or Albert, or Chelsea? Just initial inputs. That's a big question. So the floor is open for whoever is ready.
Well, I could start to answer. I think not the same as we have it, because it will be very difficult for normal or conventional villages to adopt that in the total, because we all together own our land. So we have 150 hectares in a cooperative organization, and usually in a village or in a city, you own your own house. So you would have to transfer somehow villages into communal until you can do so. But a lot of aspects, as I showed in the one of the last slides, can of course adapt in other villages or in also smaller parts of cities. So that's
Thank you. Albert or Chelsea, would you like to comment?
I would just say, eco-villages are very diverse. They're all over the world, and they have elaborate support means from various different sources. It's difficult to establish an eco-village, particularly in overdeveloped countries. It's sometimes easier in the underdeveloping world. And some of that reason has to do with land prices and the cost of acquisition of the basics of housing and tools and so forth. And, we have a community land trust here at the farm. It took us a number of years to establish, but it's not eligible for many of the social grant programs because anything that's given to us by the government would inure to the benefit of individuals. So we might qualify for something that's a rural development grant for, agriculture, regenerative agriculture or something like that. But for the most part, establishing an eco-village, you kind of have to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. There's nobody supporting you. When we had a good example, it was the formation of Eco-Village at Ithaca in New York. And they were starting from a university, Cornell University there in Ithaca. And they started having meetings once a week of people who were interested in starting an eco-village. And they called their group FROG, First Residence Organizing Group. And they built the first eco-village out of saving together and creating a fund, and then going ahead and starting the first neighborhood. First neighborhood was then followed by a second neighborhood called SONG, Second Organizing Neighborhood Group. And so then you had two, and then they went on and had a third. And I think you can do it that way, where you start in stages. There are a lot of places that are brownfields or underdeveloped or abandoned. You look at some of the origins of some eco-villages in Italy, and they settled, actually Germans moving to Italy and settling old abandoned villages. And I think there's an opportunity there for re-inhabiting spaces at lowered cost, and then establishing your own organizational framework and doing it right.
Yeah, that's also the case of Torre Superiore, that was founded by Italians, and they were with us in the previous colloquium. Lucilla was one of our guest speakers. Thank you, Albert. Chelsea?
I just want to offer, I suppose, that there are, like, in terms of sharing access to systems or materials that people need, there are lots of ways that people can do that no matter where they live, right? And I'm an educator, I work at a university. I often start by asking students, what do they already share? And sometimes they're a little bit confused, and then they get to things like Netflix passwords or access to libraries or these other kinds of things. And then I ask them, okay, what would you be willing to share? And they universally say everything, as long as it doesn't become an inconvenience to me, right? So just changing kind of how we think about access to shared systems, that's something that everyone can do in their own life, regardless of where they live. And I would say there are what I would call transaction costs associated with that, kind of the management of those shared systems. Somebody has to oversee that. But even if it's just as simple as letting somebody use your lawnmower in the US, where we have big green lawns, so that somebody else doesn't need to buy one, right? We can all do do more sharing. And I would say that that's one of the things that I would say everyone can take is decommodifying relationships and access to the materials and the systems that we need. Everyone can do that wherever they live. I think there's a lot of potential there, particularly for those of us who are in positions of privilege. Decommodification and sharing is something we can do. What I've seen is the biggest challenge for eco-villages is land ownership and who's owning the land and what does that mean in terms of access to the land, access to housing, of course, and that's tied to ownership and the economics pieces of it. And so I think that just recognizing the barriers around private property ownership and how we access land and spaces for building are very real barriers that take some creative solutions. And there are really great solutions out there related to nonprofit ownership or land trusts, but that takes some real commitment from people who are privileged enough to own private land holdings that could be transitioned in that way. And then, of course, access to housing is huge. I would also say within the US context, when we're thinking about alternative kinds of building or systems, local zoning and code making is we cannot understate the importance of those things for having a more regenerative relationship to the land. Because if you have to use a septic tank, if you cannot build with straw bale, if there's no way to disconnect from the utility meter because they see off-grid living as somehow uninhabitable, like those zoning decisions really shape what's possible. So one of the sort of precursors to creating more spaces of intentional community or eco-village is to change some of that local zoning and coding those regulations. And again, I don't know how much that translates, but that's my experience here in the US.
Thank you, Chelsea. And that's the time for us to open this conversation, because I know some people have been quiet. We have a bunch of researchers around and also community members. So I will ask the team to open breakout groups. So we could be there for 10 minutes or 15 maximum. And the idea is for us to share what kind of climate action do you already take? What are the main learnings from this session, if there is? And any other experience, inspiration that you can share? It's going to be a kind of brief check-in in 10 minutes, and we come together for the final reflections. Whenever we are ready, Rebecca. Super.
I don't want to go.
You can just
maybe we
stay.
can pause the I can pause the recording.
Yeah.
Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. Good to see your smiling faces. How was the conversation, reflections? The floor is open for a few voices. Maybe we could hear from the 4 groups. Any insight, anything you would like to share? What touched you especially during this session?
Well, just when we were breaking up, we were talking about the Ukrainian migrants. And I was not able to remember the names of some of the eco-villages in Europe that are the largest sponsors, but I know that there are hundreds now of places where these migrants have farms, Denmark being among the largest of them, the most receptive. Countries like mine in the United States are very restrictive towards immigrants of any kind. And it's a big political battle, as it is in many other countries at the moment. But I think that eco-villages are kind of one of the ways we get around governments is that we have a sense of nationality, a sense of sovereignty that transcends traditional national boundaries, that we are all eco-villagers. And so I still have friends in Russia that I communicate with on a regular basis, Russian eco-villagers, even though we may have some different opinions about what's going on in Ukraine. But we still have much to talk about eco-villages. And I think that that's really one of the benefits of the eco-village movement is it gets above or beyond this nitpicky discussions about differences between cultures.
Thank you, Albert. Any other reflections, comments?
I don't mind offering, and maybe it's in some ways connected. I think our conversation ended with a really, for me, kind of interesting consideration of who's a part of the collective when we're thinking about collective action and how that ties to the very different relationships that people have with the land. Again, thinking specifically about the US context, most eco-villages that I'm familiar with are very not diverse and are very white dominated spaces. And that's, I think, in many ways related to the histories of the land, that for the original inhabitants, relationships with the land are marked by centuries of genocide, cultural erasure, and for descendants of the slave trade, relationships to the land are also marked by exploitation and never being a part of the systems that they have been engaged with. And so just recognizing that when we're thinking about who's engaged in collective action, there's a really interesting, I think, consideration of who's left out of that collective and how relationships to the land and those cultural histories are a really important piece of understanding what it means to think through who's who's going to be interested in or who's going to resonate with land-based movements for regenerative practices. If you've never had a relationship with land that is not marked by exploitation or erasure or removal, it's hard to imagine going back to the land as some sort of positive or healing process. For me, that's interesting, particularly to think about the differences across the US and different European countries where there's very marked differences, but there's a similar kind of pattern or trend. I think that's interesting.
Kelsey, any other inputs?
What I was thinking about is for the future, there will be even more immigrants and refugees coming into Europe and also coming into Germany. And now at the time, as we maybe have 4 or 5 people who are not German in our Sieben Linden eco-village, and it has to do also that we have a lot of time to come so that we can live together in a harmony. And it needs a lot of time, and sometimes we discuss about the 20% we don't agree on. So until not to look at the 80% that we agree on. And I think there will be a time where we don't have to discuss about that anymore. But we need to be open for new people who come, even though maybe there will be more social conflicts about that. But we are still in a zone where it's nice to live and we can have a good living with each other, but we need to open. And it takes time until we do that like that, because we like to have we like to have an easy and nice life. So it will change. It will definitely change.
Thank you, Christoph. That's an important reflection. And I think as an eco-villager and also eco-village researcher, I think one of the most difficult parts that we need to invest energy is the social aspect of living together. And that's what caused the collapse of many groups. So for sure, that's something we need to learn, like these skills, or relearn, maybe unlearn some of them, so we can live well together as a human society. And I think I can also add that for me, it's important to see that eco-villages are somehow gaining space and expanding the bubble. Yes, we are these living laboratories, but now we are in like conversations with like governments, universities, and other stakeholders, and this is important. So people, even if you are not living in eco-village, you can adopt an eco-village lifestyle. How can you live light on Earth and create synergies and exchange more wherever you are? And I feel the Transition Towns movement brings some inputs in this direction for the ones who live in cities. And I think it's also worth mentioning that eco-villages are part of the last IPCC report as a very good model of sustainable living. And maybe in this last minute, I could share it with you because I think it's really inspiring. It's not really, yeah, it's working. So for the ones who have not seen it, here is the IPCC report with Findhorn Eco-Village at the cover. And you can, I will share the link on the chat so you can see more, but it's part of the work that Albert was mentioning at the beginning of going mainstream and sharing what we have been learning for the last decades. All right. We have a few minutes to wrap up. I'm extremely thankful for all of us, each one of you that decided to join us in this session, especially for the three of you, Albert, Chelsea, and Christoph, for attending our call and being here sharing with us. That's really meaningful. That was a very good conversation. There were some comments on the chat, also thanking the three of you. And I want to share that the next colloquium somehow will weave into this conversation, especially the point you mentioned, Chelsea. We will have in October 26, the fourth colloquium, Eco-Village and the Commons. And we will talk about communal living and collectivism and solidarity economy and so on. So put it on your schedule. Very soon we will share it publicly with guest speakers and more inputs. So thank you so much. And maybe we can open our mics in this final minute to share our gratitude with our guest speakers.
Muchas gracias. Gracias y felicidades.
Thank you so much. Great colloquium.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks for joining. Thanks for sharing your knowledge.
Thank you.
It's always good to.
Nice to meet you all.
Thank you.
Yeah, good that you could come today, Zola. Finally.
Yes. Please don't make it any earlier. It was already 6 a.m. my time, so that's about as early as I can get up. Thanks for making it at a time I could participate.
Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day, morning, afternoon, evening. Hope to see you in our next colloquium.
Yeah, goodbye.
Okay, bye.
Thank
Thanks for the
you.
resources.
Bye.